Good morning. Today I will discuss on Robert Burns's two poems. The first one is A Bird's Epitaph, and the second one is his patriotic poem Scots Overhead. Before going to these two poems in general, for the first time I have to say something about Robert Burns. Burns's poems, as we know, that Robert Burns's influence on the English Romantic movement has been questioned seriously in the past 30 years. Most of the 19th and early 20th century historians considered him the first important Romantic poet in Britain, one who broke from quote-unquote the measured declamation and thus restored passion to British poetry. More recently, few historians have accepted the older evaluation of Augustan poetry, but while some have gone on to modify the older thesis by describing Burns as a transitional poet between the Augustan and the Romantic movements, others have broken entirely from the older thesis by denying Burns any anticipation of or influence on Romantic poetry. Burns's, apart from the Burns's biographical detailing, the most important thing that I have to suggest here that Burns's sole poetical work is his volume of poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. That means whenever we will deal with Burns's poems, the fundamental focus must have to be given on his Scottish temperament and how so far the typical Scottish temperament differs from his English tastes, and somehow we have to consider the most important thing here, that is the Scottish War of Independence and its basic implications in Burns's poetry. As I've suggested that in Scottish dialect, the volume of poems that were published in 1786 at the nearby town of Kilmarnock. The Kilmarnock volume was an extraordinary mixture, you see. It included such poems like The Cotter's Saturday Night, To Mouse, To Lows, The Two Dogs, okay, The Holy Fair, Address to the Dale, Scotch Drink, Halloween, etc. And Burns edited the volumes 5 times during his lifetime. Can you imagine that? Tam O'Shanter was included in the 3rd edition, and the Kilmarnock volume contains more than 200 songs and great number of short epistles, epigrams, elegies, and other types of miscellaneous verse. To be specific, whenever we will deal with Burns's poems, as I've already suggested, that Burns's poems fall under the group of poetry that can be considered as transitional poetry. Now, the question certainly arises, what do we mean by transition, and how so far these poems are considered to be the transitional poems. What do you mean by transition? You see that the term transition is actually referring to a kind of a change, you see. It's a transit from one particular state to another. Now, when Burns is coming to write his poems, he falls under the group of the transitional poets. Why? Because he is, not only he, but also the other poets like there is Gray, there is Thompson, right? There is Collins. So these are the poets who actually ventured into writing a kind of poetry that is anticipating or that are anticipating the Romantic literature to come. Somehow they come at the particular juncture between the Augustan period, that is the broader section of the neoclassical period, and the Romantic period that is coming at the forefront. So therefore, whenever we deal with the features of Burns's poetry, we find that there are some features that we have to concentrate on. Say, for example, the matter of lyricism, number 1. Number 2, it is being referred as emotion because it deals with some emotions. Burns's poetry is charged with emotions actually, which sets him apart from the Augustan period or Augustan poetry in general or Augustan school. There is a matter of subjectivity, Okay, I'm providing the basic implications or the basic features that have to be traced in Burns's poem in general. Okay, so there is subjectivity, as we know that the personal feelings and emotions have been reciprocated in the form of the poetry, and the subjective notions, you see that what I am feeling is more important than what society feels through us. So it is the subjectivity, that is the subjective in character, that is the facts of his own life as well as his views and opinions gets reflected in his particular form of poetry, that is called the subjectivity. There is another important thing that we find in Burns's poem. It is the typical Scottish temperament, you see, that somehow it's a kind of a long clash, long conflict between Scotland and England throughout. There is a big history regarding the colonization and regarding the dominations and so. And somehow the Scottish writers are always trying to portray their Scottish temperament, their Scottish identity in the form of their poetry. So far as Burns's poems are concerned, you see that somehow the poetry of the Scottish peasants are to be found, are to be traced. Because himself a Scottish peasant, Burns wrote frankly as a peasant. That means whenever you will go through the poems that are dealing with the Scottish peasant, for example, the Bard's Epitaph, okay, you can find this particular form is being continuing. So where Burn is representing himself as a peasant, here it is not a peasant, rather a bird has been taken into consideration. He was in fact the poetic chronicler of the thoughts and feelings, the racy humor, the joys, sorrows, passions, superstitions, you see, and the philosophy of the Scottish farmers that gets the pages in Burns's poetry. Even their lawlessness and debaucheries find expression in his poems. That is very important here. Another important thing that Burns's poems are to be considered as the representation of Scottish poetry. You see, the Scottish, as I mentioned just now, that is the Scottish identity, Scottish temperament, the presentation of Scotland, its history, its chronicle, its the negative and positive traits of the Scottish temperament, all these things, and obviously the war of independence that is fundamentally being present here. So representation of Scottish poetry has to be considered as one of the chief ingredients or one of the chief features of Burns's poems. Another important thing that I have to suggest here, it is that Burns's love for humanity, the human temperament or the humane temperament rather, that finds its place in Burns's poetry. The love and sympathy for humanity, it comes to the present here. Democratic quality, it has to be considered another chief ingredient, another feature of Burns's poetry. Okay, why it is democratic? Because he was keenly alive to the revolutionary changes that were taking place in his age. Okay, and that you will find in the poem that I'm going to discuss. It is the poem that is titled as A Scots Wha Ha, or maybe Robert Bruce's address to his troops at Bannockburn. The next thing that is, the typical temperaments of the romantic authors that get inaugurated in Burns's poetry. It was love for the past, number one, treatment of nature, number two, heart-to-heart appeal, that is the direct reciprocation, direct lineage between the poet and the readers. And somehow we can find that Burns brought some features in his poetry that is to be considered, or that are to be considered as inaugurating romantic literature. And later on we will find that William Wordsworth and George Byron, they were very much influenced by Burns's poems. Somehow, so these are the basic features that you have to concentrate on, along with the features that have to be traced in the typical transitional poetry, okay, of the transitional age. So the first thing that I have to discuss on, it is the poetry that is a bird's epitaph. What is epitaph? Okay, fundamentally, what I have to suggest here, that the epitaph or this particular poem, it brings the Kilmarnock edition that I have mentioned just now. That was 1786 to a closure. That means it was the last poem in that particular form. Critics have found it strange that the Kilmarnock edition, which is otherwise full of songs of a virile spirit and much energy, must end with 3 of the somber epitaphs. Okay, so this particular edition actually, these were closed with the 3 epitaphs that are dealing with some somber and sad detailings, you see that. Because you see that the epitaph, this very term, as we have already suggested in the lecture containing Thomas Gray's elegy written in country churchyard, there was a particular section that is called the epitaph, that is the lines that are inscribed on the tombstone somehow. So the three somber epitaphs, they were included in this Kilmarnock edition, and these were considered to be the last 3 epitaphs. The 2 epitaphs preceding this include an actual one for Burns's father, number 1, and another for Robert Aitken. Okay, so these were the 2 poems that were ascribed to them. Noble and Scott Hogg attribute these to Burns' sense of symmetry of the Kilmarnock edition, which begins by celebrating the unrestricted energy of a natural poet in nature's bird, quote-unquote nature's bird. The single most important influence of this poem, that is A Bird's Epitaph, as I have already suggested for this poem, is Thomas Gray's melancholic poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, because the common fate of erasure from historical memory or ordinary and extraordinary lives is the poignant keynote of this poem. Somehow the same temperament, the same kind of reciprocation is to be found in this poem altogether. Victorian critics have been unfavorable to the reading of the poem, dismissing it as an exhibitionist charade for the eyes of the English literati. But David H.S. rejects it, saying that despite its Scots literary form, it is otherwise English in inspiration and timidly gentle in attitude. So it was the particular comment that was made by David H.S. However, it was William Wordsworth who was extremely influenced by Burns, and somehow we can find the basic trains of this particular poetry is got reciprocated in the poems written by William Wordsworth later. So to deal with this particular poem first, that is A Bird's Epitaph, the first thing that you have to discuss on, that is the conception of an epitaph, and what is the significance of this particular poem. And somehow the title actually signifies it is a bird's epitaph. So who is a bird? Generally, if we have to concentrate on the title, we find that a bird is a minstrel, you see. Okay? And whenever you are thinking of a bird, B-A-R-D, bird, it has to be located with the typical village-oriented or rural landscaping details. And somehow birds are famous for their songs, generally folk songs. With the bird, we can find some chronicles of history is always being incorporated. That means whenever a bird is engaged in a kind of minstrelsy, that means he's using his songs, we can find some historical references from these linings, you see. And it is a bird's epitaph. That means somehow this particular poem is indicating towards the end of the bird's life, somehow. So the question certainly arises, what is the fundamental focus of this particular poem? In A Bird's Epitaph, it actually indicates that a bird is dead. Now the question is, who is this bird? Is it completely referring to a bird that is completely indistinct? That means an anonymous, or maybe a person of indistinguishable, or rather it is referring to Burns himself. As it was a valid question considering Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, the question certainly arose there altogether, that whether the person that Gray was mentioning there towards the end of the poem, it was referring to any villager, okay, or rather it was signifying Gray himself. The similar question must arouse here also. That means, who is this bird? It is simply referring to a bird, that is another bird, or maybe it is referring to something that has some autobiographical touch. That means the bird is referring to himself, that is Burns, obviously. So the topics that we have to discuss on, the topics that we have to keep important, that we have to think important. Number one, it is the consideration of the epitaph. Okay, you have to consider that whether A Bird's Epitaph is a melancholic poem, or write a note on the significance of the title, A Bird's Epitaph, or how so far this particular poem has to be considered as a melancholic poem. Another important thing, another important topic that we have to focus on, it is the autobiographical implications, you see. Because whenever, as I've already suggested, that it is a general tendency of Robert Burns to use some Scottish temperaments, to work on Scottish temperament in his poetry. So therefore, the history of Scotland and the autobiographical implications have to be identified in this particular poem, that is A Bird's Epitaph. Another thing that is important, as I think important, it is the political implications. That means, though you can find that this particular poem is belonging to the transitional poetry, but along with the basic features of transitional poetry, we have to trace the political implication that is lying beyond, you see. Because it is two particular identity has to be disclosed here. The first one is a Scottish identity and the second one is the English identity. And you will find that so far as the poetry is concerned, there is a conflict, there is a clash in between the Scottish and English identity that have been made by Burns. He is deliberately choosing these particular words and linings, you see. Because at the very beginning, the first sections, you will find that the Scottish terminologies have been incorporated, whereas towards the end of the poetry, we find that the pure English wordings have been used. Okay, because I'm suggesting here that it begins with the Scottish temperament, but ends with English carefully written stanzas, right? Okay, so far as the national character is concerned, and so far as the English turned voice, okay, that can be linked with to his supposed bardic failure, that have to be taken into consideration while discussing the particular poetry. So let us begin then. What is important here, you know, that the poem has got 5 stanzas, and each stanza consists of 6 lines. And if you try to trace the typical rhyme scheme, you will find that it was written in AAA, BAB section. All the 5 stanzas, these are written in this particular format. I'm repeating, it is AAA, BAB format. Okay, you see that the terms like fool, rule, snool and dool. Okay, so these are actually rhyming, and line number 4, that is near, and tear, line number 6, these are also rhyming. And what is important here, you see that whenever you will deal with the A section, that is the lines, first line, second line, third line and fifth line, these consist of 8 syllables in each line, whereas line number 4 and line number 6, these are of 4 syllables. So this is a typical stanzaic pattern that Burns is using in this particular poem. And as I've suggested that some Scottish temperament has to be traced in Burns's poetry. So in this particular poetry, you can also find that the Burns is deliberately choosing some words that have their Scottish spelling, obviously. So you find here O-W-R-E, or probably, and it is actually referring to over. That is, in English we find O-V-E-R. So O-W-R-E, it is the Scottish spelling, and we find that it is actually referring to over. So what it says, in the first stanza, Burns writes, "Is there a whim-inspired fool, over fast for thought, over hot for rule, over blate to seek, over proud to snool? Let him draw near, and over this grassy heap sing a dule, and drap a tear." So somehow the fundamental focus of this particular stanza is bring the person so that he comes here and over this grassy heap of what? Actually it is a bird's epitaph. So somehow it is referring to the incorporation of death, because the bird is dead and he has been buried, and on his grave the epitaph says that bring a person. Who is the man? A whim-inspired fool. Whim-inspired. So it is referring to the whimsical personality. Now, why I am suggesting here some political implications are altogether present, because you will find the terminology. Say, for example, in the first line, you will find the term inspire. The second line, you will find the term like rule. Okay, so inspiration, rules, these are the terms that have to be considered, that have to be taken with some political thoughts, you see. So is there a whim-inspired fool? So the question certainly arises. Over fast for thought, okay, that means he's very fast for thought. Over hot for rule. So these are somehow, say, over hot for rule, over blate. Blate, this particular term means shy, okay, S-H-Y. So over shy or too shy to seek. Over proud to snool. Snool means submit tamely. So somehow these are the terms, these are antithetical terms obviously. So the question certainly arises that are these terms suggesting any other person, or is it referring to the negative aspects of a man? Somehow. So the whim-inspired fool, this particular term, the whimsical man, it is implicating some negative aspect of a person who cannot rule properly, because he is over fast for thought and over hot for rule. Hot, this particular term is indicating the anger that is present within this man. He is over shy to seek. He is as shy so that he cannot come to the forefront. So he cannot seek anything, and he is over proud to snool. Snool means submit tamely. So these are all the features that have been taken into consideration here. That is whim-inspired fool, over fast for thought, over hot for rule, over blate, that is over shy to seek, over proud to snool. So you see, so the are these terms indicating something positive, or rather these are referring to the inability of the person to rule properly, to lead properly, to guide properly? And the question certainly arises that guiding whom? Okay, so these are referring to the general Scottish people, right? So here it says, therefore, so is there a whim-inspired fool, over fast for thought, over hot for rule, over blate to seek, over proud to snool? Let him draw near. So bring him here, and over this grassy heap sing dule. So grassy heap referring to the grave, and he must sing a dule, that means sing sadly, and drop a tear. So that is the typical elegiac notion that is taken into consideration, because it is the same kind of thing that was written in elegy written in country churchyard. And as I've already suggested, that this particular poem was influenced, okay, Burns was influenced by elegy written in country churchyard by Thomas Gray. The second stanza, in the same fashion, it continues. Is there a bird of rustic song? So you can find that the different kinds of birds have been taken into consideration. In the second stanza, it says, is there a bird of rustic song? So generally, the bird has to be treated with the rusticity. One thing here I have to comment on, that Burns's theories of writing poetry, these are referring to the humble and rustic life. What I have to suggest here, that the considerations of humble and rustic life regarding the subject matter, regarding the pattern of poetry, was considered to be made famous by William Wordsworth in his preface to lyrical ballads that came in the year 1800, right? Because there Wordsworth was denying and defying the typical neoclassical trend and tendencies of writing literature, and somehow William Wordsworth is writing or indicating to something kind of a change, you see. The humble and rustic life has to be treated, the language that they should use is a language really spoken by men. Okay. Somehow what I have to suggest here, that Burns was the first person who actually indicated the using of the rustic song, the using of the humble and rustic life, and using of the language really spoken by men from the rural perspectives. It is not Wordsworth, rather Burns. And Wordsworth had a deep influence from Burns's writings. So here it is the same thing that Burns is using. He says, is there a bird of rustic song who, noteless, steals the crowd among? So somehow in this particular stanza, you will find some heroic endeavor has to be taken into consideration. Actually, it is referring to a person who can lead, who can guide the general persons towards something positive. It is actually indicating towards some radical thoughts altogether. So is there a bird of rustic song? That means the bird who can sing rustic song. It actually indicates the poetry, the poet who can write about the rustic people, who can write about write on the problems and struggles of the general people, you see. So is there a bird, because bird has to be transferred as a poet. So is there a bird of rustic song who, noteless, steals the crowd among, that weakly this area throng? O pass not by, but with a frater feeling strong. Here have a sigh. So it is another thing. Frater feeling. It is referring to Scottish fraternity. Frater feeling means it is the typical brotherly feeling that is taken to fraternity, you see. Somehow here I do remember another poem by W.B. Yeats, and the name of the poem was Easter 1916. It was also it was considering on Easter uprising. It is the Scottish and altogether the typical Irish, not Scottish, it is Irish temperament that Easter uprising is being incorporating. So somehow the typical temperament of Easter 1916, where W.B. Yeats was thinking about the change, the terrible beauty that W.B. Yeats was recurrently using. The same thing is being pointed by Burns here in A Bird's Epitaph. Here he says, is there a bird of rustic song who noteless steals the crowd among? So notelessly, who is stealing the crowd among that weakly this area throng. And then he says, oh, pass not by, but with a frater feeling strong. So you must have the frater feeling, you must have the Scottish fraternity, you must have the typical brotherly feeling. So it is, you can identify here a national identification to the representation of a character is being made. Here have a sigh. So it is another kind of a bird that Burns is trying to express or trying to point here. The third stanza begins in the same fashion. It says, is there a man whose judgment clear can others teach the course to steer? So it is the same thing, you see, that it is referring to a particular bird, and by extension you can think about a poet or maybe any author who can write his writings and it can influence the people in general. So that's why here it says, is there a man whose judgment clear? So that means the person who is of clear judgments, he knows very well that what I have to do and what I have to not. So here he says, is there a man whose judgment is clear? He can others teach the course to steer. Here steer, this particular term, is referring to lead or guide, right? This is precisely what catches the fancy of Wordsworth. He saw himself as a Vedic poet who must guide the multitude towards a better life. And somehow this better life is the thriving focus of this particular poet also. here he says, is there a man whose judgment is clear? He can others teach. That means he can teach others the course to steer. That means towards steer towards the betterment, better life. Okay, yet runs himself, life's mad career, wild as the wave. Here pause. So the person can lead other persons towards a better future, towards a better destination, you see. Yet he runs himself, life's mad career, wild as the wave. That means this is the basic temperament of the poet. So can you not find here, that means whenever Burns is referring to a bird, is it not referring to himself? Rather, you can find that all the negative traits or all the positive traits, all the basic temperaments of a poet that is being taken into consideration here, it is actually referring to Burns himself. Here it says that means he can steer the persons, he can steer the people towards a better future, towards a better destination. But ultimately, temperamentally, this man runs himself towards life's mad career, and it is altogether is a wild as the wave. And then he says, here pause, and through the starting tear survey this grave. That means it is a place where the bird is lying. So just put a check to your movement, put a check to your journey, and pause here and start your tear and survey this grave. And now in the last two stanzas, that is stanza number 4 and stanza number 5, Burns is referring to the person, Burns is referring to the bird who is lying under the grave. He says, the poor inhabitant below was quick. So it is actually referring to the person who is dead, who is within this grave. It is also being possible that he is referring to himself here also. The poor inhabitant is the bird who is dead, the poor inhabitant who is lying there. Okay, he says the poor inhabitant below was quick to learn and wise to know. So these were the positive traits within him. He was quick to learn, he was wise to know anything. That means he was a knowledgeable man, he was a knowledgeable personality. So the poor inhabitant below was quick to learn and wise to know, and keenly felt the friendly glow. That means what it suggests here, and keenly felt the friendly glow and softer flame. You know, the friendly glow and softer flame, these are actually referring to emotional verses. That means what it tries to suggest here, that the man who is dead, the bird who is dead and who is being buried within this grave, ultimately you will find he was a person who could learn quickly. He was a person who was wise because his wisdom leads him to know everything in detail. And he keenly felt the friendly glow and softer flame. That means he could write the emotional verses. He was an emotional man. So ultimately, it is the typical form of lyricism that has to be traced in this particular writer's poetry, right? So the softer flame and the friendly glow are actually indicating towards this. But so these were the positive traits, you see. That means he had the capability of learning something quickly. He had the wisdom to know something properly. He could feel the friendly glow. He could feel the softer flame. So these are all positive traits that Burns is here using. But thoughtless follies laid him low and stained his name. So what are the follies? Is it implicating towards the typical Englishness that Burns actually have grown within him? Okay, or is it referring to something else? As I've already suggested that in this particular poem, you can identify some political implications being there, and this political implication is being suggested in terms of the Scottish versus English identity. So far as the technical perspectives of this particular poem is concerned, we can find, as I've already suggested, that the first 3 stanzas are dealing with some Scottish temperaments, whereas linguistically, the last 2 stanzas, that means stanza number 4 and stanza number 5, they are actually dealing with pure English. Pure English. It is pure, carefully chosen English. This offered actually the Scots a national character that could not be dissolved even in the midst of the English pressures. So it is implicating the English pressures, you see. So somehow it is, therefore it is referring to a kind of a clash between the Scottish temperament of the poet and the English temperament of the poet. So the thoughtless follies, it is referring to where he is lacking his Scottish identity and he is jumping towards the typical Englishness, jumping towards the English identity in general, and this particular clash laid him low and stained his name somehow. Generally, as here also an epitaph, and as I've already suggested, that Burns was very much influenced by Gray's Elegy in Country Churchyard. So it might be possible that it is also indicating towards the failure of those person, that particular person who had been mentioned in towards the end of Gray's poem, that is in Elegy. There was, the term was there that their lot forbade to become an orator. Their lot forbade to become a great nationalist. Okay, so somehow it might be possible that this line, say, but thoughtless follies laid him low and stained his name, it can also have its association with that particular failure, you see. The failure that the person's or maybe the person who was buried there and being mentioned in Elegy. These are some kind of a comparison that you have to make. Then it says in the last stanza, reader, attend. Here it addresses directly the reader, and it says, reader, attend, whether thy soul soars fancy's flights beyond the pole. So whether thy soul soars fancy's flights beyond the pole, or darkling grubs this earthly hole in low pursuit. No, prudent, cautious, self-control is wisdom's root. So it's a moralistic perspective that he is taking here. He says, reader, attend, whether thy soul soars fancy's flights beyond the pole. So is it the fancy that we have to focus on? Is it fancy that we have to chase? Okay, actually towards the end of the poem you will find that Burns is to some extent he is preaching, as he's a bird, you see, he is preaching some moralistic lessons. He says, reader, attend, whether thy soul soars, soaring, you see, fancy's flights, the metaphor of a bird is being taken into consideration here. So whether thy soul soars fancy's flights beyond the pole, or darkling grubs this earthly hole. This earthly hole is actually referring to grave in low pursuit. So what is what should be the ideal temperament of a bird? What should be the ideal temperament of a person? Soar too high, or grub this earthly hole? That means in low pursuit, that means too high or too low. It might not be possible, you see. That means as I have already suggested, this particular poem ends with some moralistic perspective. So here Burns is directly addressing his readers, and he is providing the basic implication that don't soar too high and don't grow so low. So low pursuit is altogether to be negated, and soaring too high by chasing fancy, you see, it is also to be negated. It says, reader, attend, whether thy soul soars fancy's flights beyond the pole, or darkling grubs this earthly hole in low pursuit. So what is needed here? No, prudent, cautious. So these are the terms: knowledge, prudence, cautiousness, self-control is wisdom's root. So if you can control, or if you have the self-control, if you are cautious about your future, if you have the prudence within you, and if you have the knowledge, that means overall if you have the wisdom, that is the fundamental thing that can provide you something positive, you see. That means ultimately Burns is referring to the particular thing that in spite of having the negative aspects within these characters, ultimately you have to practice knowledge, prudence, cautiousness, self-control, and that actually leads to the actual form of wisdom. That is the fundamental focus of the human morality. So So that is the poem. That is the all the 5 stanzas that I have already discussed on. So let us sum this up. At the very beginning, we can find that in the first 3 stanzas, Burns is referring to the bird. Okay, different kinds of birds, you see, and different kinds of birds are actually referring to different kinds of poets, different kinds of authors, different kinds of writers. Okay, and he says that here lies a poet, here lies another bird. The bird had something positive, but the bird has something negative too. And each and every moment and each and every time, he is trying to make others feel for this man. Okay, and this man is actually referring to himself. And at the end of the poem, that means towards the end of the poem, that is at the last stanza, he is preaching a particular kind of a moral. What kind of moral? That is, don't try to soar too high, don't try to go too low. Okay, because it is the wisdom's root lies in knowledge, prudence, cautiousness, self-control. So that is the fundamental focus of this particular poem. But I have already suggested that these are the epitaph, you know, and these are actually indicating towards some political implications, as the language I have already suggested, the linguistic problems and perspectives, the typical Scottish versus English identity. And I have already noted here that this poem offered the Scotch a national character that could not be dissolved even in the midst of the English pressures that were so forcefully present in Scotland in later 18th century. It is also referring to some political Scottish problem that was present in Scotland in later 18th century. Actually, this particular political problem and this particular political reference is being described in detail, or is to be considered in detail in our next poem, that is the poem entitled Scots Wha Ha. Okay. In this particular poem, the title Scots Wha Ha, it can also refer to another title that is called Robert Bruce's address to his troops at Bannockburn. This song actually draws on Scotland's heroic past, you see. It was written in the form of a rallying war cry given by Robert the Bruce to his soldiers before the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. But it will be discussed in our next class. Probably it will be discussed in the next time when we will deal with this particular poem. Okay.